let's start with the internal service fund. So the internal service fund, the whole concept here is that users of the government that are internal are going to be governmental employees, such as the firefighters, police, admin employees, politicians, those people. External users are the citizens. So even though we live within the government, would live within the city or the municipality, we as the citizens are external users. So the internal service fund serves the internal users, and external enterprise EE serves the external users. And with the internal service fund, we are not really looking to make a profit, right? So with the enterprise fund, sure, it's looking to make a profit, such as a utility plant, fire, electricity, water, airport. But with the internal service fund, they're just trying to earn money to reimburse the costs. So classic examples of an internal service fund, activities that would be in there, hospital cafeteria, if it's a government hospital, right? Like we're not talking about not-for-profit anymore. We're talking about government-owned hospitals. So cafeterias there, and we're also not talking about the overpriced Panera bread you'll probably see in the hospital. We're talking about an actual cafeteria operated by the hospital, not a separate food chain that just happens to have a contract to operate there as well. Motor pool, this is not something a lot of people are familiar with, and if you're not either, it's totally fine. This is a system of transportation between facilities. So if doctors need to get from hospital to hospital, and it's like a 10-minute shuttle ride on the bus, this is going to be a separate bus system that works just for them to move them around where they need to be. Also, maybe we have a shuttle system taking sanitation workers from plant to plant or from different locations, wherever they need to be transported. Central printing and duplicating services. This is going to be if you just need to make posters, flyers, anything supporting the government, right? Supporting the workers within the government. And then central purchasing and storage department, purchasing supplies, purchasing whatever the government needs to support those: police, fire, admin, anyone like that. Now, what are the revenue sources of the internal service fund and how do we account for them? Let's find out. We have restricted grant revenues. So these are going to be given to the fund rather than being earned. And generally speaking, for a lot of our funds, yeah, they can be given funds. They can be given monies because the word fund gets confused around a lot here. So I'm going to use the word monies. They can be given monies to operate rather than having to earn them themselves. And that's just the nature of the government, right? So these monies are going to be recognized as revenue in the year the funds are spent. This would be as if another government gave you money to spend for some reason, or you transferred money between funds. What about normal operating revenues? So normal operating revenues, the treatment here is the same as normal accrual-based accounting. So these are recognized when earned. Here's the journal entry to record billings for services rendered to other funds. We are going to debit cash as we received it, and then we are going to credit billings to other departments, parentheses, operating revenue. Same journal entry, maybe just a little bit different terminology, right? Because maybe they don't give us cash, maybe it's a receivable, and we don't use accounts receivable, we use the term due from other fund. Now, all these government journal entries, slightly different from naming wise from corporate. Be decently familiar with them. I wouldn't be too worried. I mean, you'll be able to tell what the receivable is, right? Think about it for a second. Due from another fund or due from customer, those are all receivables. Billings to other departments, those are revenues. So a normal interfund transfer that we have seen before is different than this. So we have seen before normal interfund transfers, and this is slightly different. So since the internal service fund is performing a service to earn its revenue, we use this journal entry. In the past, we might have seen the general fund transferring to the special revenue fund or the debt service fund transferring to the capital projects fund. We saw those journal entries of just normal interfund transfers. We don't use the interfund transfer account here because these are business type activities. Lastly, we have non-operating revenues. These are going to be interest income, dividend income, nothing too crazy, just anything that doesn't fit into these categories. And this is separated out in the financial statements and separately stated and listed. What about expenses for the internal service fund? What are the treatment there? Well, in internal service funds, we have operating, which this involves normal and customary related to delivery of services. If it's the cafeteria serving the doctors and nurses, then that is going to be normal expenses such as food, salaries, anything to keep the lights on, right? And then non-operating expenses, these are separated out from operating expenses. Again, interest expense, that's probably the main one, but anything that doesn't fit into the operating expense category. All right, establishing an internal service fund, right? So we've mentioned before how a governmental entity doesn't have to have every fund listed, right? It doesn't have to have all of these funds, and maybe the governmental entity has two enterprise funds, right? Or maybe it has 15, just depending on the size. Totally depends. Totally depends. So at some point, you're going to need to establish the fund. You're going to need to set it up and create it. Now, how do we do that? Let's think about that. Similar to how you would initially fund a new bank account by transferring money to it from an existing one, the internal service fund would receive an initial contribution or interfund transfer from another fund, such as the general fund. Now, here's where we see our interfund transfer journal entry that we've seen before. This is for recording an interfund transfer, a non-reciprocal transfer, right? So not going to be sent back to the general fund. This is a one-time to set you up and get you on your way. It's always important to think about these concepts in terms of real grounded, like how does it affect us? So setting up bank accounts, something we're all familiar with, right? And that makes it a little bit more grounded for us. What about recording the contribution of assets to the new internal service fund from the general fund? So maybe in the general fund, you purchase a cooking machine, you purchase an oven, you purchase a microwave. This is the contribution journal entry from the general fund to the internal service fund. So they could give you cash or they could give you capital assets. Moving on here, a little bit more about establishing the fund. We have sale of general obligation bonds. Now, if you want to raise money to start your internal service fund by issuing debt, you can do that. Totally fine. And this is how you'll account for it. So these lease obligations representing contracts that transfer ownership. Debit cash, credit long-term bond payable. Right? Nothing crazy. We have seen this so many times before. What about long-term advances from other funds to be repaid from the earnings, the service fund? So here, before in this one, we had a non-reciprocal transfer. It was just money given. The general fund says, don't worry about it. Don't pay it back. You're good. Here, another fund gives you some money to start operations, right? And I mean, this is all within the same governmental entity. So it's not like it's a separate entity, right? We're not talking about it like there's other people in charge. The same people are in charge of all of these. It's just accounting for it and treating it a proper way. So just like you'd have an account payable or a bond payable, you have due to other fund. Just different ways that you would set up these operations, right? If you wanted that internal motor pool, that internal bus system, how are you going to do it? This is the process. It's kind of like you establish an LLC. Like you just create it, you create the fund. The fund now owns all of the assets there. It owns the motor pool. It owns the buses. You set it up, create it like its own entity.